It all started a week before Hannah's wedding. I had swung by my parents' house to drop off a bridesmaid's gift that Hannah had pestered me about for weeks. I wasn't planning on staying long, just a quick handoff and back to my apartment. My parents weren't home, so I figured I'd leave the gift on the kitchen counter and text her. Simple. But as I stepped out onto the back patio to grab some fresh air before heading out, I caught sight of something strange. Near the rose bushes at the far end of the garden, two figures were locked in an embrace. I paused, squinting through the sunlight and shadows. At first, I thought it might be Hannah and Liam stealing a private moment before the wedding chaos. But something about their posture seemed off, too stiff, too secretive. Then I saw them move closer, and I froze. The man turned slightly, and my heart plummeted. It wasn't Liam. It was Daniel, my boyfriend of 2 years. And the woman leaning into him, her perfectly manicured hands tracing his jawline, was Hannah, my sister. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My knees wobbled, and for a moment, I thought I might throw up. My brain screamed at me to look away, to leave, to do anything but stand there like a deer in headlights. Instead, I must have gasped or made some kind of noise, because they broke apart. Daniel's face went ghostly white when he saw me. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered, scrambling for words like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Meanwhile, Hannah had the gall to roll her eyes, like I was the one inconveniencing her. "You're overreacting," she said, brushing her hair back as if she wasn't just caught sucking face with my boyfriend. I didn't wait for an explanation. I didn't need one. I turned on my heel and stormed inside, my chest heaving with a mix of anger and heartbreak. The house felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I sprinted up the stairs to my old bedroom, slamming the door behind me like I was 16 again and mad at the world. Inside, I collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one louder and messier than the last. How long had this been going on? Was it just a kiss, or was there more? Did my parents know? And worst of all, what was I supposed to do now? The next few hours were a blur. I ignored the buzzing of my phone, knowing it was probably Daniel or Hannah, or worse, both, trying to do damage control. I couldn't face them. Not yet. I replayed the scene in my head 100 times, trying to find some clue I'd missed, some sign that this was coming. But nothing made sense. Daniel and I had been going through a bit of a rough patch, sure. He'd been distant lately, canceling plans and pulling away emotionally. But I chalked it up to stress. His job was demanding, and we'd been talking about moving in together, which I knew was a big step. I never imagined he'd betray me like this. And Hannah? She was my sister. My spoiled, self-absorbed, golden child sister. But still my sister. I'd spent my whole life in her shadow, always playing second fiddle to her perfect grades, her perfect looks, her perfect life. But this was a new low, even for her. By the time the sun started to set, I knew I had to make a decision. As much as I hated the idea of stirring up drama, I couldn't let this slide. Liam deserved to know. He was a good guy, the kind of guy who actually seemed to care about Hannah, flaws and all. He deserved better than to be blindsided on his wedding day by a secret like this. But telling him wouldn't be easy. My family had always been good at sweeping things under the rug, pretending everything was fine even when it wasn't. If I came forward with this, it would blow up more than just Hannah's wedding. It would blow up our entire family dynamic. Still, I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent. I didn't know what Liam would do with the information, but I knew he had a right to hear it. I just hoped he wouldn't hate me for it. Just as I was psyching myself up to text Liam, there was a knock at my bedroom door. "It's me," Hannah called out, her voice annoyingly calm. "Can we talk?" I didn't answer. "I know you're upset," she continued, as if I'd caught her borrowing my clothes without asking, "not making out with my boyfriend. But you're making a big deal out of nothing." It didn't mean anything. I stood up and opened the door just enough to glare at her. "It meant enough for you to do it," I snapped. "And a week before your wedding? Are you serious, Hannah?" She sighed, crossing her arms like I was the unreasonable one. "You don't understand. Things with Liam haven't been great lately. I just needed someone to talk to, and Daniel was there. It was a mistake, okay?" Her nonchalance made my blood boil. "A mistake? You kissed my boyfriend. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." She rolled her eyes again, and I slammed the door in her face before she could say another word. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I made up my mind. I would tell Liam the truth. Whatever happened after that, I'd deal with it. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let Hannah, or Daniel, get away with this. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Hannah walking down the aisle in her perfectly tailored white dress, grinning ear to ear, while Liam waited at the altar, completely unaware of what had happened. The thought made my stomach churn. I kept asking myself the same questions. Was it my place to tell him? Was it even worth it? But then I'd remember the look on Hannah's face when she saw me standing there in the garden. How she didn't look apologetic, just inconvenienced. That sealed it for me. Liam deserved the truth. The next morning, I woke up early and paced around my apartment, phone in hand, drafting and deleting text messages to Liam. I settled on something simple. Hey, can we talk? It's important. I sent it before I could second-guess myself again. He replied quickly, asking if he could come over that afternoon. When Liam arrived, he looked every bit the part of a man about to marry into a family like mine, well-dressed, polite, and slightly nervous. He was holding a cup of coffee, probably from the cafe down the street, and greeted me with his usual warmth. Hey, what's up? He asked, clearly trying to mask his concern with a casual tone. I felt a lump in my throat. How do you tell someone their entire relationship might be a lie? I gestured for him to sit on the couch, and I perched on the edge of the armchair across from him. My hands wouldn't stop fidgeting, so I clasped them together tightly in my lap. I don't even know how to say this, I began, my voice trembling. But I need to tell you something. Something that happened yesterday. He tilted his head, his brow furrowing. I could see him mentally running through all the possibilities. I decided to rip the Band-Aid off. I caught Hannah kissing Daniel. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Liam's face didn't change at first. It was as if his brain needed a moment to process what I'd just said. Then his eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in deep thought. Your boyfriend? He asked finally, his voice eerily calm. Yes, I said, barely above a whisper. He leaned back on the couch, running a hand through his hair. And you're sure it was what it looked like? I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I wanted him to say something, anything, to break the tension, but he just sat there, staring at a fixed point on the wall. I started to second-guess myself. Maybe I should have brought proof. Maybe I should have confronted Hannah again to give her a chance to confess. I'm sorry, I blurted out. I didn't know if I should tell you, but I thought you deserved to know before the wedding. I couldn't just stay quiet. He finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. Thank you for telling me, he said simply. That was it. No yelling, no demands for more information, just those 5 words. I felt a rush of relief that he didn't accuse me of lying, but his calm demeanor unnerved me. Do you believe me? I asked hesitantly. Yes, he said without hesitation. I believe you. Then what are you going to do? He paused, considering his answer. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I needed to hear this. So thank you. I watched as he stood, placed the coffee cup on the table, and walked to the door. He didn't seem angry, just resigned. Before leaving, he turned back to me and added, This doesn't change how much I appreciate you telling me the truth. No matter what happens, you did the right thing. When the door closed behind him, I sat there, stunned. His reaction wasn't what I'd expected. I thought he'd get angry or demand more details, but instead, he'd taken it all in stride. For a moment, I felt a flicker of guilt. Maybe he was in denial, or maybe he'd already suspected something and didn't want to admit it. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just set a chain reaction in motion. Whatever Liam decided to do, there was no turning back now. I stared out the window as the afternoon light faded, wondering what would happen next. Would he confront Hannah? Call off the wedding? Or would he bury the truth, pretend it never happened, and go through with it anyway? All I could do was wait, and hope that I hadn't just made everything worse. By the time I got my mom's call, I already had a bad feeling Hannah might try to twist things in her favor. What I didn't expect was how quickly and completely she would manage to flip the narrative. My phone rang mid-afternoon, and Mom didn't even wait for me to say hello before she launched into an attack. How could you? She hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Do you have any idea what kind of stress Hannah is under right now? And then you go and pull something like this. I blinked, holding the phone away from my ear for a moment. What are you talking about? I managed to say, already knowing the answer. You know exactly what I'm talking about, she snapped. Hannah told me everything, how you accused her of kissing Daniel. Your own boyfriend, for God's sake. How could you try to sabotage your own sister like that? I felt my blood pressure spike. Mom, it's not an accusation. I saw them. with my own eyes. They weren't just kissing. It was, I trailed off, realizing how futile it was to explain to someone who had already made up their mind. Well, Hannah says it was nothing. She says you must have misunderstood. Maybe you're just projecting because things with Daniel haven't been great lately, Mom said, her tone dripping with condescension. My jaw clenched. I know what I saw, Mom. I didn't misunderstand anything. Oh, stop it, she said, cutting me off. Hannah's stressed enough as it is. Do you really think this is the time to start stirring up drama? You need to apologize and drop this nonsense before you ruin everything. The call ended abruptly, Mom hanging up before I could respond. I sat there, my phone still pressed to my ear, stunned. My own mother thought I was lying, or worse, that I was deliberately trying to cause trouble for Hannah. Later that evening, my dad called. I'd hoped he might be a little more reasonable, but no such luck. Your mom says you had some kind of fight with Hannah, he began, his voice weary, like I was just another item on his list of things to deal with. She kissed Daniel, Dad, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I caught them. That's not a fight. It's a betrayal. He sighed heavily. Look, I don't know what's going on between you and Hannah, but this isn't the time to blow things out of proportion. She's about to get married, for God's sake. Whatever this is, you need to work it out and move on. You know how important this wedding is to your mother. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What about what's important to me? I shot back. Or to Liam, for that matter? Do you even care about the fact that Hannah cheated on him? That's not for you to decide, he said firmly. Let them deal with their relationship. Stay out of it. The conversation ended much like the one with Mom, me feeling like the villain for daring to speak the truth. The only person who seemed remotely on my side was my cousin Jess. When I told her what happened, she didn't act shocked. If anything, she looked like she'd been expecting it. I don't know how you put up with her, Jess said, shaking her head. Honestly, I've seen her and Daniel acting weird before. Like too flirty, you know? I just thought I was reading into it too much. Her words gave me a strange sense of relief. At least I wasn't crazy. Why didn't you say anything? I asked a little sharper than I intended. Jess shrugged. I didn't think it was my place. And honestly, I didn't think you'd believe me if I brought it up. I couldn't even argue with that. Hannah had a way of convincing people she was always the victim, no matter the situation. She'd been doing it her whole life, and I'd fallen for it more times than I cared to admit. I just don't get why everyone's so quick to defend her, I said, feeling the anger bubble up again. She's the one who screwed up, not me. Jess sighed. You know how this family is. Hannah's the golden child. She could burn the house down, and your mom would probably say you gave her the matches. The next few days were hell. My parents barely spoke to me, except to make passive-aggressive comments about letting things go. Hannah, of course, acted like nothing had happened, sending out cheery group texts about last-minute wedding details and bridesmaid schedules. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be Liam, but he never reached out. I had no idea what he was thinking, or if he'd confronted Hannah. The not knowing was the worst part. At one point, I thought about skipping the wedding altogether. But Jess convinced me to go. You can't let her push you out, she said. And besides, if Liam's planning anything, you're going to want to see how it plays out. She wasn't wrong. As much as I hated the idea of being in the same room as Hannah and Daniel, I couldn't shake the feeling that the wedding might be the climax of this whole mess. And if it was, I wasn't going to miss it. Little did I know things were about to get even messier. The week leading up to the wedding felt like trudging through quicksand. Everything moved slowly, suffocatingly, but no one dared to acknowledge the elephant in the room. Hannah continued on as if nothing had happened, flooding our group chats with updates about seating arrangements, dress fittings, and itineraries. She sent out reminders to the bridesmaids, myself included, like she hadn't obliterated my trust a few days earlier. Daniel made a few half-hearted attempts to reach me. At first, it was through texts, "Can we talk?" or "I need to explain." When I didn't respond, he switched to calls, which I let go to voicemail. The messages were full of excuses, attempts to shift the blame. It wasn't what it looked like, he kept saying. But I knew better. If he couldn't own up to what I'd seen with my own eyes, there was nothing left to discuss. I was done with him. The end of our relationship wasn't even the hardest part. What gutted me was the realization that I'd spent 2 years with someone who could betray me so easily, and with my own sister, no less. I kept waiting for Liam to do something, anything. He had to confront Hannah, right? Call off the wedding? At least demand an explanation? But day after day passed, and I heard nothing. Jess and I tried to guess what he might be thinking. Maybe he's trying to keep the peace until after the wedding, Jess suggested as we sat in my apartment one night, scrolling through photos of Hannah's latest Instagram post. It was a shot of her and Liam at their rehearsal dinner, smiling like they were the picture-perfect couple. Or maybe he doesn't believe me, I muttered bitterly. The idea made my chest tighten. I'd gone out on a limb to tell him the truth, and the possibility that he might have dismissed it felt like a slap in the face. Jess frowned. He believed you. I could tell by the way he acted at your place. He's probably just waiting for the right time to deal with it. Liam's not the type to make a scene unless he has to. I wanted to believe her, but as the days wore on and the wedding loomed closer, my doubts grew. I started questioning whether I'd done the right thing by telling him at all. Maybe I should have let him figure it out on his own. The morning of the wedding arrived, bringing with it a mix of dread and morbid curiosity. I'd spent the previous night agonizing over whether I should even attend. What was the point of being there, pretending to celebrate a marriage I knew was built on lies? I texted Jess to tell her I was thinking about skipping it. She called me immediately. "Don't you dare bail," she said, her voice firm. "You've already put yourself in the middle of this. You deserve to see how it ends." "It's not like I can do anything to stop it," I said, flopping back onto my bed. "You've already done your part. You told Liam the truth. Now it's up to him," she reminded me. "But if he's going to make a move, it's probably going to happen today. Do you really want to miss that?" As much as I hated to admit it, she had a point. I'd been sitting in a limbo of uncertainty all week. If nothing else, showing up would give me closure one way or another. The venue was stunning, a picturesque garden filled with string lights and floral arrangements that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Guests milled about, sipping champagne and chatting, completely oblivious to the drama simmering beneath the surface. I arrived with Jess, who had graciously agreed to carpool with me, so I wouldn't have to face anyone alone. "Remember," she whispered as we walked toward the seating area, "whatever happens today, you did the right thing." I nodded, though my stomach churned with nerves. I spotted Liam near the altar, chatting with his groomsmen. He looked calm, almost too calm. It was hard to tell if he was putting on a brave face or if he'd truly decided to go through with it. Hannah arrived a few minutes later, radiant in her wedding gown, her makeup flawless and her smile wide. She floated around the guests, accepting compliments and posing for photos, as if she hadn't just turned my life upside down. Seeing her like that made my blood boil, but I kept my composure. As the ceremony began, I braced myself for what I thought would be an excruciating hour of fake smiles and empty vows. I wasn't prepared for what was about to happen. The officiant welcomed everyone and began the usual spiel about love and commitment. Hannah stood beside Liam, beaming, while he maintained his usual calm demeanor. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until the moment came for the vows. "Before we move on," Liam said, raising a hand to interrupt the officiant, "there's something I need to say." A murmur rippled through the crowd. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. Liam turned to face the guests, his expression unreadable. "Thank you all for being here today," he began. "I know you've all traveled far to celebrate with us, and I appreciate your support more than I can say." Hannah's smile faltered. She glanced at him, then at the officiant, as if trying to figure out what was going on. "But," Liam continued, his voice steady, "I've realized that I can't go through with this. I've come to understand some things recently that made me question whether I truly know the person I'm about to marry." Gasps filled the air. Hannah's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing whispers of the guests. Liam didn't respond to her. Instead, he looked out at the crowd one last time and said, "I'm sorry, but there won't be a wedding today." Then, without another word, he stepped down from the altar and walked away. The entire venue erupted into chaos. Guests stood, craning their necks to see what was happening. Hannah ran after Liam, calling his name, but he didn't stop. My parents looked horrified, my mom clutching her pearls like someone had just cursed in church. Jess turned to me, wide-eyed but impressed. "Well, I guess Liam did have a plan after all," she said. I didn't know whether to feel vindicated or horrified. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The ceremony began like any other picture-perfect wedding. The weather was ideal, the sunlight filtering through the trees and casting a soft glow over the flower-strewn aisle. Guests filled the seats, murmuring with excitement, their faces alight with anticipation. Even I had to admit the scene was stunning. Hannah appeared at the top of the aisle, looking every bit the radiant bride. Her gown was immaculate, the lace catching the light in all the right ways. She moved with that practiced grace she always had, her chin held high, her smile flawless. Watching her, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't quite sort out: anger, resentment, and a bitter twinge of envy. How could she stand there so confidently, knowing what she'd done? As the music swelled and she reached Liam at the altar, I found myself holding my breath. He looked composed, as always, his posture impeccable, his expression neutral. But there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. Was it resolve? Or resignation? The officiant welcomed everyone and began the ceremony, his voice warm and steady. I barely listened to the words, too focused on Liam and Hannah. She smiled up at him, clutching his hands like he was her lifeline. Meanwhile, Liam remained calm, almost unnervingly so. When the officiant asked if anyone had objections, the silence was deafening. I gripped the edges of my chair, fighting the urge to stand up and scream. But I stayed put, my heart pounding in my chest. No one else moved or spoke. Then came the moment for the vows. Liam was supposed to go first. He took a deep breath and stepped forward slightly, his movements measured. "Actually," he said, raising a hand, "I have something to say." The words cut through the air, like a knife. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd, murmurs breaking out here and there. Even the officiant seemed thrown off, blinking as he lowered his binder. Hannah turned to Liam, her smile faltering. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice low but tense. Liam ignored her, focusing instead on the guests. "I want to thank you all for being here today," he began, his tone calm but carrying an undercurrent of something sharper. "Your love and support mean more to me than I can say." The guests exchanged puzzled glances, some leaning in closer to hear him better. "But," Liam continued, his voice growing firmer, "I can't go through with this." The crowd gasped audibly. Hannah's face turned ghostly pale, her hands tightening around her bouquet. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking. Liam turned to her briefly, his expression unreadable. "I've realized some things this week that made me question whether I truly know the person I'm about to marry." His words hit like a thunderclap. The whispers among the guests grew louder, a chaotic hum of confusion and speculation. Hannah took a step closer to him, her voice desperate. "Liam, stop. This isn't the time for..." But he cut her off, turning back to the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his tone final. "But there won't be a wedding today." With that, he stepped down from the altar and began walking away, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the entire venue had frozen in time, everyone struggling to process what had just happened. Then, chaos erupted. Hannah dropped her bouquet and ran after Liam, her dress catching on the edge of the aisle as she stumbled. "Liam! Liam, wait," she called, her voice shrill. But he didn't stop or even turn around. The guests began buzzing with speculation, their whispers turning into full-blown conversations. "Did you hear what he said? What does he mean, realize some things? Do you think she cheated?" I sat frozen in my seat, my heart pounding as adrenaline coursed through me. Jess leaned over, her eyes wide with shock but also a hint of admiration. "Holy sh**T, she whispered. "He actually did it." My parents looked utterly horrified. Mom was clutching her pearls, literally clutching them, while Dad rubbed his temples like he was trying to will the situation away. I could hear Mom muttering something about how this was an embarrassment to the family. As the chaos unfolded around me, I felt an odd mix of emotions: vindication, relief, and a creeping sense of unease. I'd known Liam was too principled to let this slide, but I hadn't expected him to make such a public spectacle of it. Hannah returned a few minutes later, her face streaked with tears, her veil askew. She grabbed the microphone from the officiant and tried to address the crowd, her voice cracking. "Everyone please stay," she begged. "Liam's just overwhelmed. He'll be back. This is just a misunderstanding." But the damage was already done. Guests started leaving, some discreetly slipping away, others openly gossiping as they walked toward their cars. Hannah eventually dropped the microphone and sank onto the steps of the altar, sobbing into her hands. My parents rushed to her side, trying to console her, but it was clear they were just as shell-shocked as she was. Jess nudged me. "You think she still thinks she's the victim?" I didn't answer. I was too busy watching the scene unfold, knowing that this was only the beginning of the fallout. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: Hannah's perfect image had finally shattered. Hannah bolted after Liam, her veil flying behind her like a white flag of surrender. The crowd remained frozen in stunned silence, every pair of eyes following her retreating figure. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant murmurs of the officiant and wedding planner whispering about what to do next. I stayed glued to my seat, unsure whether to feel vindicated or horrified. This wasn't just drama, it was a full-blown implosion, one that I'd set into motion by telling Liam the truth. I couldn't bring myself to regret it, though. The look on Hannah's face when Liam walked away was the kind of reckoning she'd always thought she was too clever to face. Jess leaned in, her voice low but tinged with smug satisfaction. "You called it," she said, her eyes still on the chaos unfolding around us. My mom, sitting a few rows ahead, was already sobbing into a tissue. My dad, ever the fixer, stood abruptly and stormed out in what I could only assume was an attempt to find Liam and convince him to change his mind. It was classic Dad, ignoring the root of the problem to focus on damage control. About 10 minutes later, Hannah reappeared at the venue, looking like a ghost of the bride who had floated down the aisle earlier. Her mascara had smudged into dark streaks under her eyes, and her veil was gone, leaving her hair tangled and frizzed. Her dress, once pristine, now had a noticeable tear along the hem, and dirt streaks on the train hinted that she'd stumbled in her pursuit of Liam. She marched back toward the altar, her movements jerky and frantic, like a wind-up doll about to break. She grabbed the microphone from the officiant, who looked too shell-shocked to protest, and began speaking, or rather, rambling. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, her voice cracking. "Liam's just overwhelmed. You all know how stressful weddings can be, right? He'll be back. He just needs a minute to collect himself." Her words were met with awkward silence. No one seemed convinced. Some guests exchanged knowing glances, others whispered behind their hands. The desperation in her tone was impossible to ignore. "It's not what you think," she continued, her grip tightening on the microphone as if it were the only thing grounding her. "I love Liam. He loves me. We've been planning this for months. He's not going to throw it all away over nothing." I couldn't help but wince. She wasn't just digging herself a hole, she was burying herself alive in it. Jess, sitting beside me, raised an eyebrow. "Over nothing," she whispered. Is she seriously trying to gaslight a whole crowd? It was hard to watch, but harder to look away. Hannah's voice grew more erratic with each passing second. "This is all being blown out of proportion. He just needs time. Please, everyone, just stay. He'll be back. I promise." But the guests weren't buying it. One by one, they began to leave, murmuring to each other as they walked away. Some looked genuinely disappointed, others amused. A few even seemed gleeful, as if they couldn't wait to spill the juicy gossip to whoever wasn't there to witness it firsthand. Hannah's panic grew as she watched them go. "Wait," she called, her voice breaking. "You can't leave. We'll figure this out. Just give us a minute." She turned to our parents, who had finally made their way to the front of the venue. "Fix this," she demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "You have to fix this." For once, they had nothing to say. My mom looked like she was on the verge of fainting, clutching Dad's arm for support. Dad, ever the composed patriarch, seemed at a loss for words. "Hannah," he said finally, his voice low and strained. "There's nothing we can do. Liam made his decision. That's not good enough." Hannah screamed, stomping her foot like a petulant child. "You're my parents. You're supposed to fix things for me." Her meltdown was both heartbreaking and infuriating to watch. This was the real Hannah, the spoiled, entitled version that our parents had spent years indulging. For once, the world wasn't bending to her will, and she didn't know how to handle it. Eventually, the wedding planner approached her cautiously, like someone trying to soothe a feral cat. "Miss, perhaps we should move this discussion somewhere more private," she suggested. Hannah whirled around, her face flushed with rage. "Don't tell me what to do," she snapped, before bursting into tears and collapsing onto the altar steps. She buried her face in her hands, her sobs loud and guttural, the kind that made it clear she wasn't crying over Liam. She was crying because she'd lost control. Jess nudged me again. "Do you think she's realized yet that she can't spin her way out of this one?" I didn't answer. Watching Hannah fall apart, I felt a strange mix of emotions, pity, anger, and a twisted sense of satisfaction. She'd spent her entire life pretending to be perfect, but now the cracks in her facade were too big to hide. As the last of the guests trickled out, I stayed in my seat, rooted by a morbid curiosity about what would happen next. For all her theatrics, Hannah wasn't the only one who had to face the fallout. The perfect image of our family had shattered, and I wasn't sure if any of us would come out of this unscathed. The ride back to my parents' house after the wedding that wasn't was eerily quiet. My mom had cried through most of the drive, dabbing her eyes with a tissue and muttering about the disaster under her breath. My dad, ever stoic, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. I sat in the back with Jess, who was scrolling through her phone and occasionally smirking at the texts rolling in from other guests. The tension was suffocating as we pulled into the driveway. The house, once buzzing with pre-wedding excitement, now felt cold and oppressive. Hannah had come home separately with a few of her bridesmaids, but as soon as she walked through the door, she stormed upstairs and slammed her bedroom door shut. No one followed her, not even Mom. Dinner that night was awkward, to say the least. My parents tried to carry on as if things were normal, but it was impossible to ignore the giant elephant in the room, or rather, upstairs. Every now and then, Mom would sigh dramatically, glancing at the staircase like she was waiting for Hannah to descend in tears, begging for their support. When dessert came around, Mom finally broke. "This is all your fault, you know," she said, her voice sharp as she turned to me. I blinked. "Excuse me? You had no business interfering in Hannah's life," she continued, her voice rising. "You put these ideas in Liam's head. If you hadn't meddled, none of this would have happened." I felt my anger flare. "Are you kidding me right now? Hannah is the one who kissed Daniel. Hannah is the one who cheated on Liam. But sure, let's blame me for telling the truth." Mom's eyes narrowed. She said it wasn't what it looked like. You could have let it go. But no, you had to make it your mission to ruin her big day. Ruin her big day? I laughed bitterly. She ruined it herself the moment she decided to betray her fiancé. Don't put this on me just because you can't handle the fact that your golden child isn't so perfect. The room went silent. My dad cleared his throat, trying to play mediator. "Let's all calm down," he said. "There's no point in arguing about this now. What's done is done." Later that night, I overheard my parents talking in the living room while I sat in the kitchen nursing a cup of tea. Their voices were low, but the house was so quiet that I could catch snippets of their conversation. Mom was adamant that they should reach out to Liam. "We can fix this," she insisted. "Maybe if we explain." Dad cut her off. "There's nothing to explain. He's not coming back and you know it. How can you be so sure?" "Because Liam's not like us," Dad said, his tone uncharacteristically bitter. "He's too principled for that. If he believed even half of what was said today, he's already done with her." Hearing those words from my father, a man who had spent years enabling Hannah's behavior, was jarring. It was the first time I'd heard anyone in my family admit that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the villain in this story. As for me, I felt strangely numb. The house felt too quiet, too tense, like we were all tiptoeing around a powder keg waiting to explode. Hannah stayed locked in her room, refusing to come out even when Mom tried coaxing her with tea and snacks. I didn't feel triumphant or even particularly vindicated. What had happened at the wedding wasn't something to celebrate, even if it was a consequence Hannah had brought on herself. But I wasn't sorry either. She needed to face the fallout of her actions, and if it tore our family apart in the process, so be it. Jess texted me later that night from the guest room she was staying in. "Jess, this is the most drama I've ever seen in real life. I'd say congrats, but I think you already know you were right." Me. "Doesn't feel like a win." Jess, give it time. She'll either grow from this or double down. My money's on doubling down. I had a feeling Jess was right. Knowing Hannah, there was no way she'd admit fault. She'd find a way to twist the narrative, make herself the victim, and somehow pin the blame on everyone else. But as I lay in my childhood bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized I didn't care what story she spun. I knew the truth, and so did Liam. And in the end, that was all that mattered. 3 days after the wedding debacle, I was finally starting to feel like I could breathe again. The fallout from the event had been exhausting, both emotionally and mentally. My parents were still in full damage control mode, while Hannah had yet to leave her room, and Liam had gone completely silent. I was trying to find some sense of normalcy when I heard a knock on my apartment door. When I peeked through the peephole and saw Daniel standing there, I froze. My first instinct was to ignore him, let him stew in his regret, but curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. He looked terrible. His hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. This wasn't the polished, charming man I'd spent 2 years with. This was someone unraveling. "I made a mistake," he said as soon as I opened the door. His voice was shaky, and he sounded like he hadn't slept in days. I don't even know why I did it, but I can't lose you. I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. You don't know why you did it? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You kissed my sister, Daniel. And I'm supposed to believe that just happened. I swear it didn't mean anything, he insisted, stepping closer. His desperation was palpable, but it only made me angrier. I was stupid. I wasn't thinking. You made a choice, I snapped, cutting him off. You didn't trip and fall into her arms, Daniel. You decided to betray me. And now you want to come here and act like it was some momentary lapse of judgment? He flinched at my words, but didn't back down. It was a mistake, he repeated, his voice growing firmer. I love you. I don't want to lose you over something that didn't mean anything. I folded my arms across my chest, staring him down. If it didn't mean anything, why do it? Why risk everything we had for a meaningless kiss? He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he looked at me with those same pleading eyes that used to make me melt. But now, all I saw was someone who thought he could manipulate me into forgiving him. I'm done, Daniel, I said finally, my voice steady. There's no coming back from this. You didn't just hurt me, you broke my trust. And frankly, I deserve better. He looked like I'd slapped him. You're just going to throw us away? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. No, Daniel, I said coldly. You threw us away the moment you decided to kiss Hannah. He stood there for a moment, as if trying to process my words. Then his expression shifted, his desperation replaced by something sharper. You're not perfect either, you know, he said, his tone accusatory. The comment caught me off guard. What's that supposed to mean? I demanded. You act like you're so righteous, like you've never done anything wrong, he continued, his voice rising. But you're just as flawed as the rest of us. Don't act like this is all on me. It felt like a cheap shot, a last-ditch effort to deflect blame, but his words stuck with me. What was he trying to imply? Was this just his way of lashing out, or was there something I didn't know? Get out, I said, pointing to the door. He hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but something in my expression must have warned him not to push any further. Without another word, he turned and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. After he was gone, I sat on the couch, replaying our conversation in my head. I wanted to dismiss his parting words as nothing more than a desperate attempt to make himself feel better, but a small part of me couldn't help but wonder. Was there some truth to what he said? I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that he was the one who'd betrayed me, not the other way around. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that maybe there was more to this story than I realized. The weeks following the wedding were chaotic, to say the least. My parents walked around like they were in a daze, trying to pick up the shattered pieces of their perfect family image. Mom called relatives nonstop, issuing carefully crafted excuses about Liam having cold feet. Dad barely spoke unless it was to scold someone for making things worse, usually me. Hannah remained holed up in her childhood bedroom, alternating between angry outbursts and eerie silence. Jess and I kept our distance from the madness, choosing to hang out at my apartment instead of dealing with the tension at my parents' house. But even away from the epicenter, new revelations began trickling in, each one more shocking than the last. The first bombshell came from Jess, who had a knack for being in the right place at the wrong time. One afternoon, she called me with an urgency in her voice. I was at the coffee shop near Mom and Dad's, she said, and I overheard your mom talking to Mrs. Turner. You know, her busybody friend? Anyway, she was going on about how Hannah's always been a little reckless with relationships. What does that even mean? I asked, already feeling the knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Jess hesitated. Apparently, there were a few incidents before Liam. Guys she was dating while stringing along others, that kind of thing. Mom said they always handled it quietly, so no one would think less of her. I sat there, stunned. You're telling me this isn't the first time she's done something like this? Sounds like it, Jess said. But your parents have been covering for her. Mom made it sound like it was their job to protect Hannah's reputation, no matter what. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. It explained so much. Why Mom and Dad always bent over backward for Hannah, why they were so quick to defend her even when she was clearly in the wrong. They weren't just enabling her, they were actively shielding her from the consequences of her actions. Then came the message from someone I hadn't heard from in years. Kelly, an old friend of Daniel's who had drifted out of our social circle long before the wedding drama. Her text popped up out of the blue one evening. Kelly, hey, I heard about what happened at the wedding.
I'm so sorry.
I thought you should know something about Daniel, though. Curiosity and a sinking sense of foreboding got the better of me. I replied, asking what she meant. Her response came quickly. Kelly, I know this probably isn't what you want to hear, but Daniel's cheated before. Multiple times. He cheated on his last girlfriend, too. I just thought you should know. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. I wanted to believe Kelly was wrong, that she'd heard some rumor and jumped to conclusions. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Daniel's sudden distance, his excuses for canceled plans, the way he'd tried to downplay what happened with Hannah, it all fit. The realization hit me like a freight train. I'd been blind. All this time, I'd convinced myself that Daniel was different, that our relationship was built on trust. But now I couldn't ignore the possibility that I'd been just another notch on his belt, someone he'd discarded the moment he got bored. As I pieced together the fragments of these revelations, I started to see my family and my relationship with Daniel in a new light. My parents' obsession with maintaining appearances had enabled Hannah to avoid accountability for years. Meanwhile, I'd been so focused on being the good sister, the one who didn't cause problems, that I'd ignored the red flags in my own life. One night, Jess and I sat on my couch, a bottle of wine between us, as we tried to make sense of everything. It's like the whole family is built on a foundation of secrets and lies, I said, taking a sip of wine. Jess nodded. I don't think it's just the family. I mean, look at Daniel. He's a walking red flag parade, and you didn't see it until now. No offense. None taken, I said with a wry smile. You're not wrong. But it's not just about Daniel or Hannah. It's all of us. Even me. I've spent so much time trying to keep the peace, trying to make everyone happy, that I didn't see how screwed up everything was. Jess raised her glass. Here's to the dysfunctional family legacy. I clinked my glass against hers, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were still more secrets lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to know the truth. Life after the wedding felt like walking through the aftermath of a hurricane. Everything familiar had been upended, scattered, and broken. The cracks in my family's foundation weren't just exposed. They were yawning chasms now, impossible to ignore. And while I hadn't been the one to swing the wrecking ball, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd held the door open for it. Hannah hasn't spoken to me since that day at the altar. At first, I thought she might reach out eventually, try to spin her side of the story, or at least scream at me for ruining her life. But she's gone silent, retreating to some inner world where she's the victim and I'm the villain. Occasionally, I hear snippets about her from Mom, something about how she's looking at a new job in a different city or how she's been seeing a therapist. I want to feel relief that she's trying to fix herself, but it's hard to care when the apology I deserve still hasn't come. Liam, meanwhile, has disappeared completely. He moved back to his hometown within a week of the wedding, cutting ties with my family so thoroughly that it's almost impressive. He blocked all of us on social media, and even Jess's attempts to check in on him have gone unanswered. I don't blame him. If I were in his shoes, I'd want nothing to do with the tangled mess of our family, either. Daniel's absence feels less like a loss and more like a relief, though his parting words continue to haunt me. I replay them in my mind when I'm alone, trying to decipher whether they were meant as a cheap shot or a genuine observation. You're not perfect either, you know. Don't act like you've never done anything wrong. At first, I dismissed it as deflection, his way of shifting the blame when he couldn't own up to his mistakes. But the more I thought about it, the more I wondered if there was some truth to what he said. I'd spent so much of my life trying to be the good one, the dependable sister who never rocked the boat, that I hadn't realized how much resentment I'd bottled up. Maybe part of me wanted to see Hannah fall from grace, to prove to everyone and myself that she wasn't as perfect as she pretended to be. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but one I can't avoid. I did the right thing by telling Liam the truth, but I can't deny that I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction watching Hannah's world crumble. That's not an easy thing to admit, even to myself. My parents, predictably, are still trying to piece together what's left of the family image. Mom's relentless in her attempts to smooth things over, dropping hints about family dinners or rebuilding trust every time she calls. Dad's quieter about it, but I can see the disappointment in his eyes when we talk. They haven't said it outright, but I know they blame me for what happened. In their eyes, I could have kept quiet, let Liam and Hannah's relationship implode naturally, and avoided dragging the whole family into the fallout. Part of me wonders if they're right. Did I overstep by getting involved? Would it have been better to let Liam figure things out on his own? But then I remember the look on Hannah's face at the altar, the moment she realized her lies had caught up with her. It wasn't joy I felt in that moment, it was something closer to relief. For once, the truth had won out over the carefully constructed facade. And while it didn't feel good, it felt necessary. The truth is, I don't know where this leaves me. My family feels more broken than ever, and I'm not sure it's something we can fix. Maybe we don't need to. Some wounds don't heal. They just scar over, a reminder of what was lost and what we learned. As for me, I've started to accept that trust is a fragile thing, easily broken and hard to rebuild. It's going to take time to feel whole again, to let anyone close enough to risk being hurt. But for now, I'm okay with the uncertainty. Maybe some things aren't meant to be fixed.